Well, today is a broadcast that I've been looking forward to for some time because it's different than what I usually do here on WHRO. You know, Virginia Opera does a lot of standard operas. We do Tosca, we do Don Giovanni, we do Bohème. And you folks out there, if you are inclined to listen to a station like this and listen to a program like this, you probably are somewhat familiar with these operas, and in many cases, you're quite familiar with them. So when I come on to do my shtick here, I'm kind of in the position of telling you something, helping you think of it in a different way, shedding some new light on it, giving you a different take, and making you think in a new way about something familiar. And that's valuable and so forth, but today's program is different. I really feel kind of useful here. I'm going to help you know what to expect from an opera that I'm virtually certain you do not know. Philip Glass's Orphee. Uh, People have a fear factor when it comes to this composer. I'm going to help you get over that. By the time you finish listening to me, you're going to find yourself actually looking forward to Virginia Opera's production. You may change your mind somewhat. I think your perceptions will be turned upside down a bit. First, a little bit about the background of this opera. It is, of course, based on the familiar mythological tale of Orpheus, which began in antiquity in the form of a Greek myth and was later taken up by Roman poets such as Ovid in his Metamorphosis. It has been the subject of many dozens of operatic adaptations, most notably by Christoph Willibald Gluck in his 1760s version that is probably the definitive operatic treatment for many people. I suppose you know the story that Orpheus is a great singer and instrumentalist whose playing and singing could make the very stones weep. His beloved wife, Eurydice, dies, goes to the underworld. Orpheus pursues her because of his great love into Hades, and so seduces the gods with the beauty of his singing and playing as he campaigns to have her returned, that they allow her to come back with him to the real world, with the proviso that he is forbidden to look at her. If he is to look at her even once, she will return permanently to Hades. This, of course, happens. You hear echoes of so many other familiar stories in this outline. It reminds us of the biblical story of Lot and Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt. It makes us think in the operatic world of Mozart's magic flute and the Prince Tamino being forbidden to speak to his lady love, Pamina. What you need to know about this opera by Philip Glass is that it is an adaptation of one of the great cinematic masterpieces. Now, operas are usually adaptations. You know, Tosca is an adaptation of a famous play written for Sarah Bernhardt by Vincent Sardou. La Tosca, La Bohème was based on a novel by Murger, and so forth. This is an adaptation of a 20th century art form, the film, and it's different. You know, usually when we adapt novels, plays, or films for the stage, you have to make concessions. You have to change things and tweak it to make a libretto, because music takes longer to sing than words do to speak. You're bound by the rhythms of the music, and there's usually a lot of repetition in musical numbers. Lines are repeated to help the musical form and so forth. So there are a lot of cuts and changes, and you change the ending, maybe make it happier if it's a tragic ending. Philip Glass did something remarkable and, as far as I know, unique. He took the screenplay of Jean Cocteau's film Orphee, which it comes from 1950, and he set it to music, word for word, changing nothing, so that the screenplay, you know, which is the film term for a script, the words that the actors speak, it becomes the libretto. It is a film set to music. That's a really different way of constructing an opera. And it should prepare you for the fact that some elements of opera that you think of, you're probably not going to find. Jean Cocteau is a fascinating figure. He is part of that very heady period in French history and artistic history in which you had great geniuses gathering together in the cafes and saloons of Paris, France. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Stravinsky, Picasso, Diaghilev, so many others, all kind of drinking red wine, getting drunk, smoking, having sex with each other, and creating wonderful paintings, drama, dance, and music, and so forth. Cocteau was always at the forefront of this scene. He collaborated with Stravinsky, writing the libretto for Oedipus Rex. He wrote the libretto for an opera of Francis Poulenc. He created the scenario for many ballets, including Parade by Erik Satie, which had also collaborations with Picasso and other great artists, and Apollinaire. And by the time he writes his film Orphee, he is an elder statesman. He is no longer the enfant terrible that he was in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And his take on the tale of Orpheus is somewhat different and very personal. In this film, Orphee is a national hero in France. He's the greatest living poet, and he is a national celebrity. Teenage girls flock after him on the sidewalk, begging for his autograph. Well, we may smile a little bit at the idea of a poet getting that kind of attention, but, so think of him in our culture as maybe a rock star or a star athlete. And Orphee has a problem. He is very famous, but he's looking over his shoulder at a young rival, the young poet Segeste. And Segeste is the buzz. There's a great deal of buzz in the cafes about this young poet. And Orphee feels a little bit paranoid. He feels like the public is losing interest in him, even though he's he feels at the top of his game. You know what it reminds me of, opera fans? If you're familiar with pro football, I'm thinking of the Indianapolis Colts quarterback Peyton Manning, who is one of the most popular athletes that we've had in the last several generations, quarterbacking the Indianapolis Colts. He holds a lot of records. He's a beloved figure. He's been on Saturday Night Live, but he's 36 years old, and there's a young rival. The Colts are going to draft that hotshot college quarterback, Andrew Luck. And Peyton Manning is feeling a little shaky about just how much his team wants him anymore. Well, this is what's happening in Orphee's screenplay, the way he treats the character of Orphee. And it's very personal because Orphee is really representing Cocteau himself. Cocteau feels that the public is forgetting about him in the arts scene in Europe, and that others are coming along and replacing him in the estimation of the public. So he's really kind of identifying with Orpheus, and Orpheus is going to travel to the underworld. Eurydice, or Eurydice, as she is called in this French film, and the opera is, of course, sung in French because Glass is using the original screenplay. Eurydice is sent to the next world. In this opera, you travel into the next world through mirrors. The film has wonderful images of supernatural figures and characters from the real world walking through mirrors to enter the next to enter the next world. And Cocteau said about that after all, mirrors are how we all face our mortality, because we all look in mirrors every day and see ourselves one day closer to our death, with another gray hair and another wrinkle. And in this film, Orphee is going to meet a mysterious woman, the princess, who he comes to find is actually a representative of death. She is, in a sense, his own death. And the film has the theme of artists contemplating their death, being in love with their death, and eventually conquering death in order to achieve the mortality that is every artist's desire. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the film and how Glass has treated it, but let's talk about Philip Glass. Uh, when I think of Philip Glass, I think of an old story about an elephant. There were three blind men who encountered an elephant in a field one day. One blind man went up and grabbed a hold of the elephant's tusk, and he said, "Oh, an elephant is just a skeleton. It's nothing but bones." Another blind man reached back and felt of the elephant's long, skinny tail and said, "Well, an elephant is a very slight thing. It's thin and hairy." And a third blind man wrapped his arms around one of the elephant's great legs and said, "Well, an elephant is immense, like an oak tree." The point is that you have to be able to see an entire elephant to understand what it is. And Philip Glass has written so much music. He is so prolific, and there is such variety in it that if you have heard on WHRO or in another recording or in a concert somewhere, if you've heard music of Philip Glass and you decided it wasn't to your taste, I can't stand that music, you must beware, because Philip Glass has even more variety than a big old elephant does. Uh, and if you've heard other operas by Philip Glass, including the recent Metropolitan Opera production that was sent into movie theaters across the country of Satyagraha, I want to tell you Satyagraha is as different from Orphee as the Barber of Seville is different from Pelléas et Mélisande. So hang with me. One thing also to keep in mind about Philip Glass is even if you've heard very little of his music, well, that's only what you're aware of. Philip Glass is around us everywhere. I swear, 50% of the TV commercials that you hear these days employ music that is either by Philip Glass or a clone of Philip Glass. He has scored movies that you've seen, including The Illusionist, and even some horror films, and The Hours, a film which won an Academy Award for Best Actress for Nicole Kidman. He's a very distinguished and honored film composer. My favorite TV show is House MD. I never miss it. It's appointment TV for me, and I even watch the reruns. And the other day was an episode in which the patient of the week was a ballet dancer, and we saw her succumb to some mysterious illness in the opening shot, which was of a working ballet rehearsal, complete with orchestra. And this is the music that they used in this episode of House for the ballet production. Now, that music, you'll notice, it's got some characteristic features of Philip Glass. There's a lot of repetition, a certain mechanical quality. The term that is always applied to this composer is minimalism, along with other American composers such as Steve Reich and John Adams, the composer of Nixon in China. Mr. Glass absolutely loathes that term, minimalism. Well, it's kind of too bad for him. I'm afraid he's stuck with it. It's what most people think of. And it implies rather than looking at music through a telescope like the stars in the heavens, it focuses on the small materials, like looking through a microscope, seeing all the teeming life inside a drop of water, if you will, taking very few musical materials and repeating them at length with minute nuances of variation of rhythm and pitch. And some of this music is difficult for those of us who like traditional classical music of the great masters to listen to. Back in the days of Mr. Glass's Enfant Terrible stage, his first opera, Einstein on the Beach, contained music that many people found, to be quite frank and not to put too fine a point on it, kind of obnoxious, like this excerpt from Einstein on the Beach. Now, just to allay your fears, my opera loving friends, Philip Glass's Orphee sounds about as much like Einstein on the Beach as Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, okay? Allay your fears, relax. That's not what we're going to present to you. Of course, if you really enjoy that and find it mind bendingly awesome, then you'll be disappointed, I suppose. But we're talking about something much more traditional. And in fact, this minimalism, it's really not all that revolutionary. My friends, minimalism has always been with us. Repetition of small musical ideas has always been from the earliest days. You know, have you been to a wedding lately? Did they play Pachelbel's Canon in D? Yeah, it's minimalism. Listen to it. It's the same bass line over and over. And that proceeds for what? Another more of the same bass line over and over. Even Johann Sebastian Bach, in many of his works, including Well Tempered Clavier, takes a small pattern and does subtle variations, retaining that pattern throughout. Here's the Prelude in C from the first volume of Well Tempered Clavier. Now, compare that Bach prelude with an etude for piano by Philip Glass and see if, Philip Glass is not really so much a revolutionary, my friends. He is totally aware of not only music history, but his indebtedness to music history. See if you hear some echoes of Bach in this etude from number 2 from his volume 1 of etudes. Pretty clear when you hear them side by side, isn't it? I would consider that an homage to Bach's keyboard works. Well, Orphee is an opera that is chock full of homages, as you will hear as we go through the rest of this broadcast today. Now, as for Satyagraha, and this is not only something that helps explain this Satyagraha opera about Gandhi, but much of Glass's musical output in general. As a young man, to make some cash, he transcribed sitar works of the great East Indian musician Ravi Shankar, and became quite interested in these ragas of the Indian culture, and also in Eastern thought and spirituality in general. And this informs and infuses his opera about Gandhi. Um, there is this Eastern concept of meditation, of being at peace with one's environment, of not trying to manipulate the world or the people in the world or the environment around you. And there is a chant like quality to much of Glass's music, and a kind of a passive, a deliberately passive element in which listeners often, of course, Glass has his critics. The New York Times critic for many years, Donald Hennahan, once said that Glass's music is to music as See Spot Run is to literature, just making a kind of a surface observation about the simplicity of the materials and the repetition. But many listeners and many critics who have been won over find that as these repetitions wash over them like waves at the seashore, that they experience a kind of a bliss and ecstasy. Here is a good example of that kind of Eastern-influenced writing in Satyagraha with the evening song. And in that particular passage, that phrase that you heard is repeated by, in that case, I believe the artist was tenor Douglas Perry, is repeated no fewer than 30 times, which is something we're not accustomed to in opera, that much repetition of such a simple idea. Is he just an amateur musically? Is he just untrained? Couldn't he think of anything else? Oh, absolutely not. Philip Glass is Juilliard trained, and he also studied extensively with Nadia Boulanger, the greatest composition teacher of the 20th century in Paris, and with Darius Milhaud at the Aspen Festival. He is a rigorously trained, comprehensive musician in all aspects of musical arts. And when he chooses to write like this, it's a choice is emblematic of his philosophy about the function of music. Now, let's get into Orphee, shall we? Something else I think of when I think of Orphee. Did you see the Golden Globes the other night? Woody Allen won a Golden Globe for his film Midnight in Paris. I saw that with my wife back in the summer. It was one of Woody's more successful comedies. Did you see it? The main character, Gil, played by Owen Wilson, is a guy who's in Paris with his fiancée. She's only interested in shopping and spending money in shoes and so forth. But Gil is in love with the culture and the historical past of Paris. You know that nightclub scene with Hemingway, the Fitzgeralds, Picasso, Stravinsky, Salvador Dali. You name any seminal artist of the first half of the 20th century, they were probably slurping up wine in the saloons. And Gertrude Stein. Gil has an amazing experience. He's so in touch and in tune with that milieu of old Paris that every night at midnight something magical happens. He's no longer in modern-day Paris. A vintage auto picks him up and deposits him right there where all those people are. Gertrude Stein reads the novel he's working on. He drinks a beer with Hemingway. He falls in love with some famous chanteuse. And then the next morning, he's back in the real world, much to his displeasure. I think that Philip Glass would really identify with Woody Allen's film Midnight in Paris. I think he has the same degree of affection for and admiration for that Paris cafe scene, of which, of course, Jean Cocteau was such a leading figure. I think that this opera, Orphee, is Philip Glass's tribute to that world that I suspect he wishes that he could only go back in time and visit, just as Gil did. Now, here's something interesting. when Philip Glass was at Aspen in the 1960s, and you know, Glass went to Paris several times as a young man. He mastered the language, spent some time in Paris learning the language. As I mentioned, spent some time studying with Nadia Boulanger. And then after Juilliard, he was at Aspen, where Darius Milhaud, now an elderly man, was in residence. And just as Gill might have done, Philip Glass spent time just talking with Darius Milhaud, not about what's wrong with my counterpoint or how do you like my music, but tell me about Paris. What was Stravinsky like? What was Picasso like? What were they all like? Tell me the stories. And the old man, somewhat flattered for all this attention, told about the old days. Now, Darius Milhaud had quite a role to play. The opening scene of Orphee takes place in a cafe modeled on the very cafe where many of these artistes hung out. It was a cafe called Le Bœuf sur le Toit, the ox on the roof. Now, you need to know that Darius Milhaud spent a couple of years in Rio de Janeiro in a minor diplomatic post as an aide to a diplomat, where he became intoxicated with Brazilian music, the samba, the rumba, the tango, and in particular a tango that was very popular called Le Bœuf sur le Toit. When he went back to Paris and began his musical career, he wrote a lot of jazz-infused, Brazilian-influenced instrumental music, such as the Scaramouche Suite for two pianos and a ballet called Le Bœuf sur le Toit. And not only that, but the cafe, which was the focal point for the place where all these artists would meet and greet and make their plans for new masterpieces, came to be called Le Bœuf sur le Toit after the popularity of Milhaud's ballet. Now, here's something interesting. Let's hear a little bit of the beginning of the very opening of Milhaud's ballet, The Ox on the Roof, Le Bœuf sur le Toit. You'll hear the jazzy syncopation. Sounds like this. Okay, just kind of gets your fingers snapping and your hips swinging, doesn't it? Now, here is music from Act 1, Scene 1 of Philip Glass's Orphee, in which Orphee is watching crowds swarm around the young poet Segeste in a cafe, which is obviously modeled after Le Bœuf sur le Toit. And what does his music sound like? Here it is. Yeah, that sounds about as much like Einstein on the beach as I, Glenn Winters, look like Brad Pitt. You see, Philip Glass is an elephant. You can't just feel the tusk. You have to look at the whole beast. So this is obviously a tip of the cap, not only to that famous café, Le Bœuf sur le Toit, but also to the ballet by Milhaud, who would likely have been one of those young students hanging around in the Orphee's milieu. So, now, something else that you have to understand about Philip Glass's music. I consider this to be a very successful opera because the music is dramatic. But it's not dramatic in the way that you and I think of music when we think of music drama, because we're accustomed to the Western idea of drama in music. And by this I mean that we like climaxes. We like scenes which build to a climax with great tension and then have this big moment of climax and then a denouement. We not only like scenes to do that, we like arias to do that. We not only like arias to do that with the big high C at the end, we like each phrase of music to build to a high point and then recede. Now, as a graphic example, the best example I could think of is the very end of the love duet in Act One of Madame Butterfly of Puccini. So listen to the tension, the glorious climax, and then the ebbing away of all that energy. I would go so far as to say, I know it's beautiful. I know you love it. I do too. It was the first opera I ever loved. However, you and I, as Western music lovers, have become addicted to this phenomenon of the exciting buildup of tension and the glorious climax. It is very Western of us. In Eastern music, this phenomenon does not exist. And you know, I'm not even so sure that it was as important back in the Baroque era. Think of that Bach prelude that we were playing just a moment ago. You know, in the Baroque period, we had the theory of the affects. The Baroque composers believed that the function of music was to select a human affect, an emotional affect, rage, amusement, yearning, melancholy, whatever it might be, joy, and portray that affect. And each movement of music was to portray that affect and nothing else. We didn't have the violent contrasts that we come to expect later in music by, say, Beethoven and the Romantics. Well, in that sense, I find Philip Glass to be kind of Baroque/Eastern in his use of affects. For instance, what happened in that first scene, by the way, is that the poet Segeste was run down in the street by a couple of mysterious motorcyclists, and his bleeding body lying in the road when suddenly a limousine approaches, and out comes this mysterious woman, the princess, who orders her chauffeur to put the injured poet in the back seat of the limo, and then she snaps her fingers at Orphee and says, "You, come with us." Well, kind of she catches him off his guard, and though he has no idea what's going on, he joins them in the limo, and they drive out into the country. The scene 2 of the opera, as it is of the film, is a very puzzled Orphee riding in the limousine on into the night on a lonely country road saying, "Well, where are we going? Is he dead? Are we going to the hospital?" And the princess saying, "These are all stupid questions. Shut up and just sit there." Well, here's some of the music from Act 1, Scene 2, and what I notice is that the affect is perfect. The music describes the rolling wheels of the limo and the agitation that Orphee feels, but it doesn't build to anything. It's not going anywhere. And when they get there, it'll just stop.
Passez-moi votre mouchoir.
Il a l'air très blessé.
Ne dites donc pas des choses inutiles.
Retournez dans l'hôpital.
When you think about it, doesn't this minimalist style perfectly convey the experience of a lengthy ride in a car when you don't know where you're going or how long it's going to take to get there? You could hear the wheels spinning, and yet there was no build-up. We weren't sort of going anywhere. And you know, there's something kind of French about that. Philip Glass is a master of the French language. He sets the language very well, and you know, when people speak in French, they do not have accents. They really do not have any kind of climax in what they are saying. They just kind of talk along like this, you know. It is a language without accents. And it's not like Italian where, I'm going to tell you something right now. Lots of climaxes in the Italian nature and in the Italian language. There's something very, very French about this. Well, they pull up to an old abandoned chalet. The bleeding body of Segeste is carried up to a room. Orphee is given cigarettes and something to drink. And the princess stares down at the dead body of the young poet Segeste, and she says, "Segeste, rise." He floats to his feet. She says, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, I know who you are." "Say it." "You are my death." "Will you obey me?" "Yes, I will obey you." And as an astonished Orphee looks on, she takes him by the hand, and they walk through a full-length mirror in the room into the next world. I just wonder if Rod Serling knew this film, because, friends, we're in the Twilight Zone, and the affect of the music that Philip Glass selects for this scene is pitch perfect. It's spooky, it's eerie. It's also, he uses keys. Up till now we've been in either E-flat major or the related key of C minor, but once we enter the next world, we're in the key area that will represent death, and that's spooky E minor.
Je le crois.
Some of the dialogue you heard in that scene from Act 1, Scene 3 of Glass's Orphee was Orphee saying, "I don't know if I'm awake or asleep." And the princess saying, "You must be asleep. I'm sure you're asleep." "Yes, I think I'm dreaming. I'm asleep," which really sums up the entire opera. When you watch The Twilight Zone on TV, you didn't know sometimes if you were alive or dead or asleep or awake. That's really the ambiance of this entire opera. We're not sure it's actually happening. It might be Orphee in a drunken stupor, hallucinating. He might be sound asleep, dreaming this entire story. When the opera comes to its end, we're not sure it ever took place. And the music perfectly, absolutely nails this dreamlike state. Well, he is driven home. He can't follow them now. It's not time for him to go into the underworld. So he's driven home by the princess's chauffeur, a young suicide victim, as it turns out, named Ertebis. It's funny, in this version of the Orpheus myth, Orphee seems somewhat irritated by his bourgeois wife, Eurydice. She's expecting a baby. She wants to tell him about it. He doesn't want to hear it. He says, "Leave me alone." He goes up into his studio, and she feels hurt. And Ertebis hangs around. The princess wants him to hang around and be available to help Orphee because she has plans for him. And Ertebis has a lengthy scene with Orphee's wife, Eurydice, in which it becomes obvious that he's kind of taken a shine to her, This young walking dead fellow, who another representative of death, is in love with Eurydice. And when he tells her, when he introduces himself to her, listen to the lush, romantic harmonies, very sensuous. Philip Glass can write love music.
C'est dommage qu'elle ne vous ait pas ressemblé. Votre nom est bien Eurydice.
Pour vous servir, j'ai oublié l'autre.
Elle te bise pour vous servir.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He's getting down to it. Eurydice and Eurydice sitting in a tree. Well, they don't actually have a love scene because she loves her husband, but he's got a soft spot for her. Now, the following scene depicts Orphee and Eurydice asleep in their bed in their lovely home in a nice posh neighborhood of Paris. Remember, he's a national hero, very famous. And the princess, while they sleep, enters their bedroom through the mirror, stands at the foot of the bed, and stares at the couple. You see, she is in love with Orphee and is jealous of Eurydice. Death is in love with the poet. Now, here is another doff of the cap. Again, Philip Glass is no revolutionary. He is aware of his place in the history of music and his indebtedness to the masters who have preceded him. Here's a little bit from the Gluck opera, Orpheus et Eurydice. There is a famous ballet in the first act with a lovely and haunting flute solo, perhaps the most beautiful music Gluck ever composed. It begins with a long sustained tone in the flute, followed by a four-note ornament. You may recognize this. It's gorgeous. Here it is. Haunting and ethereal, just the kind of music for a spirit. So here is the music that Glass assigns to the scene which has no words, in which the mysterious princess stares at the sleeping couple. It is so obviously a tip of the cap to Christoph Willibald Gluck. He inverts the shape of the melody, beginning with the four-note ornament, followed by the long sustained tone. Yeah, Philip Glass can write a pretty tune. Who knew, huh? And it's also, of course, his respectful, loving homage to the most famous operas based on the legend of Orpheus. Well, the princess arranges for Eurydice to be dispatched by those same deadly motorcycle riders. Eurydice winds up killed, and in the next world, the chauffeur Ertebis convinces Orphee that he must go down there and retrieve her, so he becomes Orphee's guide into the next world, or actually into a kind of a transitory holding cell, if you will, between whatever eternity is and the real world. There's a trial, a panel of ghostly judges. Here's testimony from all of the characters. Segeste gives testimony as to what's taken place. Orphee testifies. Eurydice testifies. The princess testifies, in which she is compelled to confess that she loves the poet Orphee. The judges say, well, we're going to convene now. You wait out there. And that gives Orphee and the princess a moment to have alone, in which they sing a rapturous love duet. Yes, Philip Glass can, what's an opera without a love duet? Well, Orphee gives you one, but not between husband and wife, but between poet and his own death. Let's listen to it. Oh, very sophisticated, very sensuous, very impressionistic, very cool, very French, this love scene. It doesn't have the same kind of passion as Tristan und Isolde or Pinkerton and Butterfly or Cavaradossi and Tosca, but isn't that sometimes how we think of the French? Do the French actually climax when they make love? I'm not sure. They probably just touch each other for a while and then light a cigarette, right? And drink some wine. It's very, very French. Well, the verdict comes down, yes, Eurydice may return with Orphee to the real world. However, just as in Virgil and so forth, and Ovid, he is not allowed to look at her. Well, there happens a kind of a comic scene in a way, a little bit like I Love Lucy and Ricky maybe, back in Orphee's home, in which now they have the reality of trying to live their domestic life without him ever looking at her. And Ertebis is kind of the traffic cop. Orphee is sitting at his desk transcribing poems that he hears on the radio, and Ertebis says, "Oh, turn your head, she's coming in." And, Eurydice, don't look in the mirror, he might catch you in the mirror. Quick, duck, you're going to see her, quick, turn around. And Orphee says, this is never going to work, we can't live like this. And you'll hear Eurydice say, oh, well, it'll just take some getting used to. I'm sure eventually it'll become second nature to us. Now, if this was a traditional opera by Mozart or Verdi or whomever, this would be a trio. You've got the chauffeur, the poet, and the wife. They would sing a nice 3-part musical number with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a climax, in which they expressed how they felt about all this. But that's not an opera. This is a film with dialogue. Films don't have trios in them. They just have dialogue. So, again, listen to just a portion of this dialogue scene in which they're saying all those things I just outlined. Notice how the affect of the orchestra, again, is perfect in conveying this tension and anxiety of trying to move around without him seeing her. And notice how wonderfully the French is set, as if by someone who was a native speaker.
Vous êtes un voleur et un assassin, rendez-vous sur votre tombe.
Méfiez-vous des miroirs.
Je ne vous le fais pas dire.
Je parle du reflet de votre femme. Faites disparaître cette lettre imbécile. Non. Une minute. Tournez le dos. Tournez le dos. Vous êtes libre.
On se représente mal la difficulté. La tension d'esprit qu'exige de la bise pareille.
Ça sera la pire d'habitude.
Drôle d'habitude.
C'est dans vos vies d'être aveugle ou que de peine vigilante.
Et puis nous n'avons pas le choix.
Well, the worst happens. It really was pretty unrealistic to think that you could, carry on in your household living together this way. He catches sight of her, and poof, she is gone. Back to Hades, back to the next world. And Orphee's got other problems. Another aspect of Jean Cocteau's film is that it has aspects of kind of a murder mystery and a police procedural, because the body of Segeste, his earthly corpse and remains, have been discovered by the police, and people suspect Orphee because it's well known that he was very jealous of this young poet who he considered his rival. So people have been hounding the police to bring him in for questioning, and Orphee has been kind of preoccupied with, death and everything and the next world and ghostly judges. So he's not kept any of these appointments. It makes him look more suspicious. And now there's a mob of angry young people, those same people who used to idolize this famous celebrity. They're out there wanting to drag him in, string him up, get him, he's a murderer. Well, before you know it, there's a gunshot and Orphee has been killed. He finds himself back in the next world, but that's fine with him because he and the princess are reunited, and they're pledging their eternal love. Oh, now we're free. But the princess makes a big grandstand play. She says, "Will you do whatever I tell you?" "Yes, mon amour." "Will you, even if it's unpleasant, even if it's torture to you, will you obey me?" Of course, my darling, I will obey you." Well, she has Segeste and Ertebis grab Orphee, restrain him, and return him for good to the living world, where he will resume his life with his wife, Eurydice. Death is sacrificing itself so that the poet may become immortal. And there is something in the music in which she is overseeing the process of returning Orphee to his destiny that has a kind of exaltation and glory. Death willing to sacrifice everything for the poet. Here she is. I think that's pretty glorious stuff. You see, don't be afraid of Philip Glass. And here's a little irony. This composer, who is so Eastern, who is so uninterested in traditional climaxes, whose music just rumbles on mechanically with little patterns over and over, actually, he couldn't help himself. That little passage was kind of climactic. It was the high point of the opera, and what follows is a denouement. The Western is coming out in him. Is a child of the West after all. And in the final scene, it's just amazing. It's as if nothing ever happened. When Orphee walks back through the mirror into his home, the clock is striking 6, and guess what? The first time that they walked through the mirror back in Act 1, it was striking 6. No time has passed during this entire episode of Act 2. And he wakes up with his wife, and they are chatting pleasantly. He's not annoyed with her anymore. He's not tedious. He's excited about the child. They're bantering the way husband and wife do, saying, "Oh, I think it'll be a boy." Well, Mr. Orphee, how do you know it'll be a boy? Maybe it'll be a girl. Oh, no, it'll be a boy. Well, I don't know what kind of behavior he'll have with a father like you. Oh, I'll be a good father, so forth, this kind of thing. And in the meantime, death, in the form of the princess and her lackey, Ertebis, they are on their way to some sort of punishment worse than we can imagine, some kind of oblivion beyond death, which they're willing to do so that Orphee may achieve his immortality. Well, when I hear this final scene, the tenderness of Orphee for his Eurydice, it comes out in luscious, impressionistic string sonorities that sound like Ravel to me. This is gorgeous music, friends. Here's a little bit of the finale of Philip Glass's Orphee.
Comment se comporte le garçon? C'est un fils. Il sera aussi insupportable que son père.
Insupportable, toi.
Beaucoup de personnes me trouvent insupportable.
Mais toi, oh, t'adore.
Et on me déteste.
The elephant that is Philip Glass. Sometimes bony tusks, sometimes stringy tails, sometimes massive legs, and with an elephant-like intelligence. This opera shows everything he's good at. You hear Glass, the master film scorer. Much of the opera sounds like atmospheric, evocative film music. You hear masterful writing for the voice and mastery of the French language, and you hear the ability to come up with drama, romance, sensuous passion. Yeah, is it like Tosca? No, not very much. But then again, Tosca is not much like the Barber of Seville. Let go of your expectations, because expectations can color our perceptions sometimes. Broaden your appetite. Don't be afraid of Philip Glass's Orphee. Come see this beautiful production at the Harrison Opera House. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.